So Jacob has been with his uncle Laban for 20 years. Now he probably didn't expect that he was going to be there for 20 years. He probably just thought maybe a few weeks. His mother would have only thought it was going to be a few weeks as well. But 20 years is how long he's been there. He had to work 14 years to pay off his marriages, and now he's worked another 6 years to get the rest of his flock and the increasing prosperity that he's had. And so as we enter this chapter, chapter 31, we see that the relationship has really soured over these 20 years. There's been a lot of deception and backstabbing and lying, and it really hasn't turned out well. The sons of Laban are looking at the prosperity and the wealth that Jacob has accumulated, and they're saying, hang on, this isn't fair. How come Jacob is doing so well and we're not getting all of that prosperity? Now, Laban was still incredibly rich, of course, but they're looking at what's happening in Jacob's property and they're saying, this isn't right. We should be getting more out of this than what he's getting. Jacob realizes that Laban no longer favors him, and then in verse 3, we see that the Lord finally comes to him and says, Jacob, it's time. It's time for you to go home. It's time for you to go back to your father's land, back to the land that I have promised you. And so Jacob is ready to head off. Now there's two sections we have to look at to understand the context of what's happening in this chapter. 6 years earlier, Jacob tried to leave after he'd finished paying off his marriages to Rachel and Leah. He needed 14 years of work to pay that off. And so he wanted to go. But then Laban had learned through divination, he says, in chapter 30, verse 27, that Jacob was the reason why he was prospering so much. So he wants to keep Jacob around because Jacob's kind of like his lucky charm. If Jacob looks after his flock, it does better. So of course, Laban, being the greedy man that he is, wants to keep Jacob. Laban offers Jacob a bribe, but Jacob refuses the bribe and says, no thank you, I'll just take wages. Laban tries to set things up so that he gets the real benefit of the prosperity that Jacob is going to bring to the flock. But Jacob, through a clever process of genetics and through God's intervention that we see in this chapter, manages to keep the prosperity going to him. And so he gets away with the greater wealth. And that sets up the tension here. This prosperity and blessing is a fulfillment of the promise that God made to Jacob in chapter 28. Do you remember when Jacob first left to go to Laban? He's out in the wilderness and he lies down one night and he puts his head on a rock. So he's sleeping on a rock for a pillow, which kind of shows that he doesn't really have much stuff. And then God comes to him in a vision, and you see the vision of the ladder that goes all the way to heaven, and there's angels coming up and down. And we see that Jesus quotes this later on in the New Testament. So Jacob sees this vision and he sees God at the top. And this is where God affirms to him for the first time that he really does have the Abrahamic blessing. He'd already got that confirmation from his dad, from Isaac, but this is the first time that God actually comes to him and says, yes, I'm going to bless you, you're going to be a blessing to the nations, and I'm going to give you the land as well. So this is when he first gives that promise to Jacob, chapter 28. So this 20-year period it's been pretty rough for Jacob, really. Some pretty bad things have happened to him and to his family. But he can see that God has kept his promises. And this is the argument that he uses to Rachel and Leah when he takes them out into the field. God has been faithful. He's protected them and he's blessed them. And Rachel and Leah can see it as well. Their allegiance has shifted from their father to Jacob. They can see that their father has been manipulative, has deceived them, has taken their inheritance as well and spent that up as well. So their allegiance has shifted to Jacob, and they're willing to go with him as well. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Why take so long to tell Jacob to leave? Why let him be there for 20 years? What's the purpose and point of that? In some ways we can't really answer that. It's just how God decided things would play out. But on the other hand, now, after these 20 years, Jacob has so much evidence, so much proof that God is true to his word. The God who identifies himself to Jacob says, I'm this God. I'm the God of your father. It's me. The God that you saw at Bethel It's me. This God who identifies himself to us, communicates to us, and makes promises, actually keeps his promises. Jacob can now look back at all the things that have happened to him, all the things that have happened to his family, and see that God really did deliver on the promises that he made. You have to wonder how strong Jacob's faith would have been if it only was a couple of weeks. If he went there, got his wives, got a few sheep, saw that God kind of blessed him and was like, sweet, yeah, I really do like this God. I really trust him. Now I'm ready to go back and inherit the promised land. I think that Jacob's faith and confidence in God would not have been as refined as it is now after all these experiences that he's gone through. Of course, that's not to say that all the things that happened to Jacob or all the things that happen to us are good or right. In fact, a lot of things were absolutely wrong and not good at all. But throughout that, Jacob can look at what has God promised me, and has he delivered on those promises? Yes, he has. So this God has been faithful to me. It's much easier for us to see how God has been faithful in the past than it is to trust him in the present. I don't know if you've seen on YouTube some of those painters that they paint in a really sort of abstract way. There's music playing, it's really nice, and there's all chaos all over the canvas, and you're not really sure what they're trying to paint, but the image starts to form over time. You think you can see something, and then towards the end they flip the picture upside down and you can suddenly see what it was that they painted, and you're like, wow, it's a face. And it's a really profound, amazing moment, and your life is changed. That's a bit like our lives as we go through experiences. During the moment, over the years, there's a lot of chaos and mess, and it's hard to see what's really happening and what's really being formed in this picture of our lives. But as we reflect back and as we think about who God is, his character, his promises to us, we can see somehow he's made something of this mess. He's made something of this picture. Or like one of those films that you watch, like The Prestige, or Memento, or any Christopher Nolan film, I guess, where there's a really great twist at the end. You're watching the movie through, and you don't know what's going to happen. And then suddenly at the end, you're like, what? I can't believe that I'm not going to spoil it. But, you suddenly have this revelation at the end. Then you rewatch the film again after you already know the twist, and you see all these signs throughout the film that the director put there, kind of little hints that you can kind of go back and appreciate later on. Again, that's what's happening for us as human beings all the time. We go through things, we suffer, we're confused, and not everything that happens to us is good or right or should happen to us. However, when we look back, we can see how God, in his faithfulness, in his character, has kept us and been there with us. This is one of the promises that Jesus makes to us, that he will always be with us, no matter what we go through. Perhaps today you could actually look back on some of the experiences of your life and ask yourself, has Jesus been with me? Has God been with me through my life? Is there blessing? Is there faithfulness there? Have a reflection on some of the things that have happened in your past experience. And again, I want to qualify that I'm not saying that you should look back on terrible moments, on bad things, and say, well, maybe this was actually good because God did something good with it. In actual fact, when we face injustice, when we face wrongdoing against us, these sort of things are not good and shouldn't happen, and we should stand up against them. But who is God? What's his character? And has he been there for us in those moments? That's a question I think we could examine today. So they have seen that this God, the God of Bethel, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and now of Jacob, he's been faithful to them. He's kept his word. He's kept his promises. They're ready to go. But that doesn't mean that their faith and behavior is perfect. In verses 17 to 21, we see that Rachel goes and steals her father's gods, and Jacob doesn't tell Laban that he's leaving. He's obviously still afraid of him and just tries to pack up and flee. And so it says that he tricked Laban and then he goes. So from verse 22, of course, Laban pursues after him, Laban goes after him. He wants his gods back, and he actually wants to harm Jacob, possibly kill him. So God comes to Laban in a dream and protects Jacob. He says to Laban, do not say anything good or bad to Jacob, which is really a warning from God to say, don't you hurt him, don't you harm him. God is going to protect Jacob and his family in the present as well as in the past, because God has made his promise to Jacob and he's going to keep his word. Now Laban goes searching for the household gods once he's arrived there and confronted Jacob and had a go at him for leaving without saying goodbye. He tells Jacob that God's actually warned him not to hurt him, so obviously Laban's not going to do that. But he goes looking for these household gods. And there's a lot of tension here because you're thinking, wow, we know who stole them, but this is Rachel. This is Jacob's beloved wife. This is the one that he worked so hard for, really 14 years to be with Rachel. And now Rachel is the one who could possibly be killed by her own father because she's stolen these gods. There's a similar theme that pops up in other stories in Genesis, a bit like with Benjamin and Joseph down the track, where Benjamin has the silver cup in his pack, and we're sort of wondering what's going to happen. So this kind of thing happens a couple of times in Genesis. Rachel's sitting on the household gods. There's a little bit of an underlying dig at the gods here, okay, that we have to pick up on. That these gods are, one, captured, stolen, hidden by a woman who's got her period, is a little bit of an insult to these gods. All right? So there's a little bit of the narrator, the writer of Genesis, having a bit of a go at these gods and saying, they're not very powerful, are they, that they get hidden in this way and Laban can't find his gods. There's also this idea of Laban just kind of gradually losing everything he's been trying to get through deceptive means. So Laban's trying to get the blessing. He's trying to get the blessing through Jacob. He knows Jacob is the source of the blessing, but he tries to get it through deceptive means. And in the end, he actually cuts himself off from it. He loses his gods. He loses his daughters and his family because he manipulates them. He's just gradually kind of losing everything that he's been trying to get throughout this chapter. And he can't find his gods. And so now he's lost them as well. But Rachel not being caught out here is also an indication, again, of God's protection. That it's not just about Jacob, but the whole family. God is there to protect what is Jacob's. And so Rachel does not get caught. This allows Jacob to have a bit of a cathartic release, have a bit of a go at Laban, and really pull him up for all the ways that he's manipulated and cheated him. Then we get this great comment from Laban in verse 43 that really shows us where his heart is at. Even though he knows in his head that Jacob is the source of his prosperity, because in the previous chapter we saw that he knew that, he figured that out. Jacob is the source of his prosperity and Jacob's God. He knows this. Even though he knows that, he still says this: the daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks. All that you see is mine. That's where Laban is at. And this is where we think, oh, silly Laban. Why can't he see that it's obviously come from God? Why can't he praise God for all the things that God has given him? But I think we should just pause for a moment and realize that surely we are very similar to Laban. We constantly hold ideas about God in our head that we don't actually hold that strongly in our heart and our behavior. And the idea of God giving us every good thing, but us still being entitled and possessive over things we own, well, that's happening all the time, isn't it? You see, often we are hopelessly unaware to how indebted we are to other people's work and the environment that we're in. In The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the hero character finds himself lost in space and the last surviving human being. He ends up on a planet with a primitive society, and he thinks to himself, this is great. Now I'm going to become the leader of this society because I'm the most educated, I know the most, I'm going to be able to build amazing things. But he discovers that he really doesn't know how to do anything. He can't make a toaster, let alone even a sandwich, is what the book says. Because he's really kind of helpless. He's so reliant on all the technology and all the tools that we had back on Earth. He's not really able to do anything. Inspired by this, a man named Thomas Thwaites recently set out to kind of test this and see what he could achieve without the use of all the things we have available to us. And so he decided to make a toaster, a cheap toaster from scratch. You can look up his TED Talk on YouTube. And he goes about spending a year making this toaster. And when I say from scratch, like not ordering the components online and putting it together, but trying to make his own plastic, trying to mine his own iron ore, his own copper, to put all the components and wiring together, make it all himself. And it turns out to be an incredibly difficult task. This is what the toaster ends up looking like at the end. The point of his exercise was not just to do something funny, but really to highlight just how indebted we are, how reliant we are on the technology we have around us. And the way that technology just keeps kind of developing exponentially so that we can do things, even something as simple as a toaster, has an incredible amount of work that goes into it. But it's the same for us and our lives. I didn't make these clothes, I didn't build this house, I don't know how to do any of that. You could say, well, I paid for it with my money. But of course, even living in a place with an economic system that allows us to earn money is something we didn't do, that we didn't make. We are so indebted to the work of others. We are so indebted to the things that were already there before we showed up. Carl Sagan says, if you want to make a cake from scratch, you first have to invent the universe. It highlights just how indebted we are to the fact that this world already exists. God is the one who has blessed us, who's given us these things, and we want to make sure that that head knowledge trickles down into heart knowledge, something that changes how we live and how we act. Otherwise, we're just going to be like Laban, intellectually assenting to something and then moving on with our lives. Jesus says in Mark chapter 8, verse 36, what does it profit a man to gain the entire world but lose his soul? What does it profit us to enjoy all these amazing, incredible things, but to not know the Creator who gives them to us so abundantly? For Laban and for Jacob, God was their protector and their provider, not just in the past, but also in the present. For us, He is also our protector and provider in the past and in the present. Well, what a story we have between Laban and Jacob as this part of the narrative wraps up, comes to a close. Laban realizes that he's a little bit stuck here. He can't harm Jacob. He can't convince Jacob to come back so that he can keep prospering off of Jacob's blessing from God. And so he realizes, well, I need to just kind of protect myself now. And so he sets up this covenant with Jacob. He said, let's make a peace agreement and we'll swear on your God so that no harm can come to us and so that I can guarantee that my daughters will be okay as well. Now, there's a little bit of a glimmer of hope here in that perhaps Laban, having lost his gods, having kind of lost everything, is sort of coming around to seeing that actually Yahweh might be the God that's worth following. And I think there's a hopefulness in that. But I can't help but also see that there's something a little bit self-serving here in this move by Laban. Jacob, of course, is just wanting to get out of there and is not powerful enough to fight him. And he doesn't care about Jacob. He's never coming back here, so he'll make the agreement. But for Laban, this is very much, I think, about protecting himself in the future. Jacob's going to go away, inherit the land, and become a really powerful warlord in the future. So what could that mean for Laban, who has cheated him and manipulated him all these years? Laban should have been the one that was protecting Jacob and caring for him. He's his father-in-law. They've been together for 20 years. But instead, he's manipulated him, deceived him, acted fraudulently, changed his wages, and then he's threatened to kill him. And now when he finally realizes that he can't get control of Jacob, he sets up a legal agreement to protect himself from any harm, any retribution, any justice in the future. What a guy. And we think, wow, he's just a really bad dude. But this kind of behavior is actually incredibly familiar. You see, all around the world at the moment, you can just do a little bit of a Google to look up some of these things. All around the world at the moment, there are Christian churches, organizations, and people, Bible believing, Bible preaching, who are being called out on this kind of behaviour over periods longer than 20 years. Christians from our camp who have spent years manipulating and mistreating their employees, who have held back wages, who have dealt fraudulently with their finance, who have abused their members, who have then covered it up, and then once it actually comes to light, get victims to sign non-disclosure agreements, a legal protection, just like Laban, so that no harm and no justice will come their way in the future. If you or I think that we're not capable of this kind of behaviour, especially over long periods of time, we need to think again, because we are. The starting place for us making sure that we don't fall into this kind of thing is remembering that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We're all capable, and so we need to come before God and say, Lord, help me see myself as I truly am, and to make sure that I personally pursue your justice and character and bringing that forward in the world. As much as this treaty may indicate some self-serving on the part of Laban, it is also God's way of providing a future protection for Jacob. In this act, God secures peace for Jacob in the future. Well, after making this covenant, Laban rises early in the morning, he kisses his grandchildren and his daughters, he blesses them, and then he departs and heads home. The irony of this final agreement is that Laban cuts himself off from any future blessing he might have been able to experience through connection with Jacob. For he's not allowed to go over to Jacob, and Jacob is not allowed to go back to him. But for Jacob, he sees another indication of God's promises to him. God was faithful in the past, God protected him in this present moment, and now God has secured peace for him in the future. And this is the same for us as well. We can look back at the past and see that God has been particularly faithful to us. He promised Jesus. He said he would send Jesus to die on the cross for our sins. And that's something for us. So in the past, God has been especially faithful. He's kept his word. Jesus says that if we follow him, that if we abide in him, he will be with us. Not only will he be with us in the present, but he says he'll be with us until the end of the age. And Jesus promises to bring us into a future peace as well. When he was being crucified, one of the thieves who was crucified with him turns to him and says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus responds, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Faithfulness in the past, protection in the present, he's with us, and peace in the future is what Jesus guarantees and promises for us. Jacob learned through his life, through a 20-year period, that God was a God that kept his word. When he finally got that word to go back to the promised land, he realized that God was someone who would protect him and make sure that Jacob got the promises that God had made to him. And as he leaves that period of his life, he makes this covenant with Laban that's going to give him peace and protection from him in the future. We are reminded and encouraged today about a God who identifies himself, makes promises to us, and keeps his word. He's been faithful to us in the past, he's with us in the present, and he will bring us into a peaceful future if we trust him and go with him. I hope that you'll be encouraged to do that today.